Okay, welcome to our next session, the World Bank's Innovations in Financing Instruments. I'm not sure if that quite captures what we're doing, but we're going to begin the session with a paper by Devesh Kapur on rethinking the financial design of the World Bank. So, Devesh.
Thank you, Kevin. And I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This is a paper that I've been working on for 2 years, which I really didn't work on. And then this deadline forced me to actually write it up. The focus of this paper is actually sort of on the IBRD, and in particular ways that its capital can be increased. And I'll explain why this particular dual focus. I won't be like discussing IDA, which is the concessional arm of the bank. Because I think its value its size has peaked, both for supply and for demand reasons. Key countries are going to be graduating in the next few years, and the demand is going to fall. The key donors' fiscal situation means that their ability to provide funds sort of in the manner that they did in the past 10 to 15 years is undoubtedly going to be falling. And C, like for the first time, the poor are not in poor countries. They are in lower middle income countries. That's where the bulk of the world's poor are, which are IBRD eligible and not IDA. The reason I want to focus on the capital of the bank is because the size of the capital of the bank fundamentally affects how much the bank can lend. The bank actually is a relatively minor player, and I think we should be very clear. Of the roughly $1 trillion of financial flows to emerging markets and developing countries, the bank's share is about 1.5% to 2%. In real terms, its lending since 1990, in fact, in some nominal terms, has been basically flat at between $14–15 billion a year, with the exception of the years after 2008 to 10, when it virtually doubled on average. But the next 4 or 5 years, we'll again see that coming down, and the average will be back to about 15 billion, which in real terms might actually be less than what it was in the early 90s. Now, one of the things, we might question many things regarding the bank, but I think on one thing there's absolutely no doubt. The bank is sort of exemplary as a financial intermediary, meaning that the rates at which it can borrow in world markets are really next to none, relatively, with the few exceptions of the world's largest countries. And so it's a pity that this quality of the bank as a financial intermediary, bar none, has not been exploited much more. The key reason why that's not been the case are the constraints posed by the bank's capital. Now, these constraints are partly in law. The articles of the bank, they put a very conservative ceiling on how much the bank can lend, which is governed by the size of its callable capital. Its subscribed capital. Now, in practice, of course, most of the bank's capital was the form of guarantees by member states. So this was the beauty of the design of the bank, which is only a small fraction was actually paid in, the rest was guaranteed. Precisely because of that, and this was, the size was low because the Britishers, Keynes both wanted the UK to have a sizable role sort of in the IBRD, but the UK was also relatively bankrupt. So one way, of course, to get around this is to say that, no, it will be large, we will have a large share, but most of the capital will be callable. So knowing that, of course, one way to try and give more confidence to financial markets was that the articles therefore had a very conservative limit on how much the bank could lend relative to the size of its capital. Now, that basic tension in some ways has never left the bank, and you could argue it's a basic tension in global governance, writ large, which is that the capital of the bank ought to increase like much more. The countries that have the power in the bank don't have the money. The countries that want to have more power and have the money, however, do not actually have the power right now in order to enforce a greater capital sort of increase. And it is this fundamental tension and how to get around this that my paper tries to sort of address. Now, the key financial parameter of any financial institution is leverage, right? Now, the callable capital of the bank, it mattered a lot in the early decades, or the confidence it gave to get its AAA rating. But I think it's fair to say, at least since the 80s, the rhetoric of the bank notwithstanding, it really is fairly meaningless. If you go through various scenarios, if the callable capital of the bank is ever called in, the bank, it's a nuclear option, in a sense. The game is sort of over. The bank as an institution would just not last. And everyone really inside and outside recognizes that. And therefore, in practice, the bank actually works and thinks about a ratio called the debt-equity ratio, right? Now, what's the bank's sort of equity? The equity, in turn, comprises of two variables. One is the paid-in capital, which, as I said, is really very small. After 60 years, the paid-in capital is barely $11 billion, right? The second part is these are reserves. And so right now, if you look at the equity of the bank, the paid-in part is about 35 to 37%. Right? The bulk of the bank's equity comes from its reserves. So the question is, how do the reserves get generated? Well, the reserves get generated from transfers from net income. Right? Now here we have a fundamental question of control of the bank and how that is affecting its reserves over the past few decades. So the question is, how does the bank actually generate its net income, right? Now, you have two variables that affect that. One is above the line, which is administrative expenses. The more the administrative expenses, the less will be your income. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. Now, one of the things that happened from the 90s is because of the criticism, often, I must say, by the legal profession, of the bank that it was doing all these bad, evil things to poor people around the world, every sort of gold plating was done in the administrative procedures of the bank. So the best bank project would be one project which would be so perfect that you could never find a single flaw and would take $1 billion in administrative expenses, right? Now, and I'll come to this because you can see a point which was raised earlier, why countries in Africa and other countries find Chinese investments so much more attractive, which is that the bank's administration put on layers, basically to ring fence itself from critiques from civil society. However, who pays for those costs? It's not the major shareholders, it's the borrowers, fundamentally. And they pay for it twice. They pay for it through much larger transaction costs in borrowing from the bank. And they pay for it in the sense that because it reduces the net income, the equity and therefore the transfers from net income to reserves is also less. Because of that, the bank's equity is less, and because of that, it can lend less. Right. So that's the link through which large administrative expenses have fundamentally been affected the future of the capacity of the bank to lend. A second way in which the net income is affected is by transfers from net income for so-called good causes other than transfers like to reserves. Now, these good causes could be transfers for funding the Palestinian Authority, which is not a member of the bank. The world thinks that they should be supported for peace reasons. Interestingly enough, the costs are borne actually by all the shareholders of the bank, even though you could argue that peace in a particular part of the world is much more a function for specific countries. You know, it's arguable that if you have a issue over there, should it be paid by the ADB or by other countries or by all the shareholders of the bank? So net income has been much less. The donors actually use part of the IBRD's net income to increase the capital of the IFC, which is a very interesting net transfer because the rich countries effectively use the money that was paid by the poor, by the borrowers of the bank to increase their control or maintain their control of the IFC without putting in more like money. So what I sort of argue is that the ways in which you can try and do this is, one is to reduce administrative expenses. One of a very good example is the bank's board, for instance. The bank spends $80 million a year just on its board. Now, if you ask yourself, $80 million, now, of course, it's a classic thing of governance. Every management buys off its board. And this is a classic. Keep them happy, give them every goodie they want. It's $80 million, that's fine, someone else is paying, right? Now you ask yourself, how do you know that the governance of the bank matters? It would be very different if it was cut to $50 million. No one would ever do such an exercise because that would require the concurrence of the very board, which is going to be cut, and that's not going to be happening, right? So what we have some ideas about how the net income could increase. Transfers from net income for reserves could increase. Therefore, the equity of the bank could increase, and therefore, it could lend not hugely more, but considerably more. The second idea which we had was one which is, and because time is short, I won't go through them all, which is, how should we think about pricing global power? It's a fundamental question, right? Everyone wants power in the world, but they want it at minimum price. So suppose you said, since everyone wants more power, sort of in institutions like the bank or the IMF, suppose you auction the shares of the bank. What would happen? I'm thinking of this more as a thought sort of experiment, right? The countries that really thought that they wanted more power in the bank would pay a higher premium because it mattered more for them. And it's unclear to me why we should not think of these more creative ways of global governance. And I say this now because actually that was the very, very beauty of the design of the IBRD by Keynes and Harry Dexter White, which is underlying the governance and control of the bank was a very simple but clear precept that power comes with a price. So the design of the IFIs were those who had more control had to pay in more like money. What happened over time was that the marginal cost of power has virtually dropped to zero in these institutions. And that is why I think the way the bigger shareholders exercise that power is less like responsible than it used to be, because it doesn't cost them as much. And I think what we need to do is to go back and rethink that principle, is to actually price power more appropriately in the global system and restore that principle back like to the IBRD. Both it will increase its own capacity to lend, and therefore it will be able to do more good. But also I think the shareholders will act little more like responsibly, because their own like money will be much more at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devesh. So our next presentation is going to be by Philipp Dann, who's going to speak about the World Bank's program for results financing.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to put this up on the whole screen. Can you just, yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. My topic here will be much narrower than the very broad and superbly fascinating presentation by Devesh Kapur right now. And it also comes from a very different perspective. I want to talk about a new lending instrument of the World Bank. It's called the Program for Results Financing. Are you able to read it? No. Okay, then we stick to this, and I will slowly, this you can read? Okay. I will slowly scroll down. It's just a one-page handout, so it's nothing too difficult. Anyway. Okay, so I want to talk about this new instrument called Program for Results Financing, P4R. This instrument was introduced just last year in February 2012, and is actually a major change for the World Bank. It is the first time in 30 years that the bank devises an entirely new lending instrument, and the new instrument will be one of only three. The other two you're probably familiar with. One is the traditional project lending, which in the World Bank is called investment lending, and the other one is the general budget support, now called policy lending, earlier called structural adjustment lending, and we heard about this already in Annaliesa's presentation. Now my presentation here will proceed in three steps. I want to first very briefly describe some central features of the new instrument. Then in the second step, I want to provide a little bit of context and ask what were the driving forces and preconditions for this innovation to happen. And then the third part will be an evaluation. Basically, what are the legal merits of this instrument? So these are the main three steps. And my presentation will evolve around two main claims. One is more substantive and the other one is methodological. The substantive claim is basically just to say that this new instrument, which I will present here, is certainly a major innovation in the sense that it creates a new way of lending that will most likely be adopted by other lending agencies, and therefore diffuse in that Schumpeterian sense as we sort of defined innovation before. So it's very, it's certainly an important innovation, and it shows that the bank is able to adapt to change through law. But my claim is that the bank uses the law too timidly, and that when we look at the concrete regulation of this new instrument, that there we see a lot of sort of gaps and a lot of empty spaces, and I'm trying to point these out. So this is the substantive claim. But the second methodological claim is, not surprisingly for me, that law is actually a central tool, not just to design a new instrument, but also to evaluate the instrument. So this involves the larger claim that the law should play an important role to investigate development finance and its governance, and should be sort of used to that end. That is probably what Devesh Kapur would then call the the expensive lawyer's approach, but I guess I can't really help it. Okay, now let's come to the first part, the description of the instrument. What are the four, I want to highlight only four central features, obviously there are more. All of these are laid down in an internal policy of the bank, the operational policy and bank procedure number 9.0. Now the first feature contains the object, the content of what is actually funded. And here the bank shifts from supporting not just concrete individual instruments and not general policies, but more programs, that is, a suite of activities which have been already planned by the borrower, and the bank is just joining into the funding of this suite of activities. The second feature of the new instrument concerns the disbursement of the funds. So far, the disbursement of the World Bank financing was linked to concrete expenditures of the borrower. So for example, and to put it very simply, when funds were spent on purchasing the concrete for a construction of the dam, the bank would disperse when receiving the invoices. Yeah? In P4R, in the new mechanism, it's slightly different. Here, certain indicators are agreed ex ante, which are supposed to measure and demonstrate the progress of a project. And only once these indicators are met, the bank would disperse its funds. So in this example, the bank pays only when the borrower can show that the dam is actually standing and holding the water. The third feature of the new instrument concerns the implementation. And here, that's another important shift, because the instrument for the first time actually puts a special emphasis on supporting the borrower during the implementation phase of the program. And here, for that purpose, the rules allow for the bank to provide capacity support and also to monitor the program made. So in some sense, the program requirements are less of fixed preconditions and more goals to be attained during the implementation. Yeah? So we see a certain shift in where the attention lies. And the fourth feature is concerns the application of safeguard policies. You're familiar that in project lending, normally every project has to be assessed to what extent there are certain environmental or social risks involved, and then the safeguard policies kick in order to put standards on how these risks might be contained. In the new P4R instrument, safeguard policies are not directly applicable. Instead, the relevant rules of the policy only lay down objectives, but not concrete standards for assessment. And these objectives are very broad. So for example, a program has to be assessed to what, and I quote, to what degree the program systems promote environmental and social sustainability or protect public and worker safety. So it's just putting out a very broad aim, but not any specific standard. Instead of the bank setting up its own and applying its own safeguard policies, the instrument relies on the country's own and the program's own systems. So they basically try to make use of the systems that the borrower has. That much on the features, some features of the new instrument. Now, I want to move on to the second part and ask what led to this innovation. What was the driver, or what were drivers in this change? And I want to highlight three aspects. One, just very briefly, are reasons of political economy. And I put down two aspects here, which Annalisa has already mentioned. One is certainly the changing landscape and the competition for emerging nations. So the bank is just trying to remain relevant in this new age of choice, as you call it, very aptly. And the other one is the donor demand for results and effectiveness linked to the Paris agenda. So this is certainly the context, and one could say this is a demand-driven innovation. The users, the borrowers, were looking for a new instrument, and the bank tried to provide this instrument. The second precondition, I would say, or driver of this innovation has more to do with the bank as an institution. And here I want to point out, which seems to be natural, but I don't find it quite natural in comparison with other international organizations, that the bank is actually willing and able to react to the new socio-political landscape and has the institutional structures to adapt. It is not a dinosaur, which is kind of stable, but it is trying to react to this landscape. And one can now discuss what are the features which make the bank institutionally able to react to changes or not, I'll not go into that. The third driver and precondition for innovation and the introduction of this new instrument, I would say, concerns the role of the law directly. And here I want to point out that the bank has a fairly transparent set of legal instruments, these OPs, BPs, operational policies and bank procedures, which lay down the general aims and instruments, procedures and standards of the bank. So the bank has an instrument, has legal instruments to actually effect change, to make its staff change its ways. Another element which is important to realize here is the last indent, that the bank uses law for risk management, basically. As it rolls out the new instrument, it uses two fairly well-known techniques to safeguard against the risk of the new instrument. One is basically an early review. After 2 years, the experiences with this new instrument have to be reviewed. This is not a sunset clause. It's not saying that after 2 years, this instrument will end and then it has to be readopted, but it is certainly a clear threshold moment for reviewing the experiences with it. And the other risk management tool here is limited volume. The policy sets down that in the first 2 years, only a total of 5% of IBRD and IDA commitments can be spent on program for the results funding. So it's a fairly they try to keep this in check. Now, the third part of my presentation moves to the evaluation. Here I basically try to ask what is the legal angle, legal perspective. And just very briefly, obviously, the law is not the only instrument to do such kind of evaluation. You can ask from the perspective of whose interest is served. You can ask what kind of business does it generate. So there are lots of perspectives, and I would say one has to integrate them. The only thing here for me is to say I want to just stress now a legal perspective, just as an example. Here I would propose to just take the law seriously. I would say the World Bank has these legal instruments, these OPs, BPs, and we can evaluate them against a a set of yardsticks. And 3 yardsticks I want to mention. One is the law of the bank itself, so its articles of agreements and its other OP-BPs. So we can ask to what extent does the new instrument comply there. The second is public international law in general, so we can ask to what extent is the bank new instrument compatible with that. And the third would be comparative law, so we could ask, do other development banks or other international organizations have a similar set of instruments? I skip this. One can make the argument, I think, that there are certain general principles of the law of development finance or the law of development cooperation which you can take from this exercise and basically evaluate the new instrument against these principles. And this is what I will do in the last 2 points, or at least in one, perhaps. And I want to pick a critical point and want to try to demonstrate that this has a critical edge, this kind of legal evaluation. But I also want to stress that there are also, from a legal perspective, very positive elements about this new instrument. So, for example, you can say the new instrument strengthens the ownership of the borrower and therefore strengthens what I would call the principle of collective autonomy. Here. You can also say this results-based disbursement strengthened the principle of effectiveness. So you can make also positive arguments about the new instrument. I want to just point now to one perhaps more critical, and this is the second point. And that would be the question about human rights. How does that new instrument actually comply with human rights? It's actually interesting that the only real opposition in the process leading up to the adoption of this new instrument came from mainly American civil society organizations, which argued that the new instrument would lower the substantive standards that the bank normally approves. So what is the legal merit of this critique? And here I would say we can use human rights or the principle of individual autonomy to evaluate the new policy. And I would argue that the World Bank is actually, as an international legal personality, bound by human rights. I would argue that it is bound by the general sort of principles of public international law, which contain core human rights. And I would also argue, as a special organization of the UN, the World Bank is bound here. Now, of course, the very details of this obligation are very difficult to pinpoint in abstract, but I think it's important for the bank to have in place a system which makes sure that certain human rights or standards are in place. And I would argue that the Program for the United Financing can sort of contain very important also social and environmental human rights risks, and that the instrument itself does not really present enough mechanisms to check this. And I can perhaps in the discussion elaborate on that a little more. Let me come to my final point, just two observations in the end. One is a kind of disclaimer, because the instrument is very new. It's just about a year old. And so we don't really have much of a practice of sort of how is this instrument used in reality and how is its legal side to be assessed in reality. But the inspection panel, so this quasi-judicial organ of the bank, has the competence to review P4R actions. So there is the hope that we might have certain cases coming out of the inspection panel, which gives us a more concrete flavor of how the instrument plays out in reality. And the other observation which I want to make is about the instrument itself. I think it's a very good example for how the World Bank is able to adapt to change and be a driver of innovation. But I think the bank is somewhat very timid in the way it uses the law. It uses the law more in a kind of principled kind of fashion. It doesn't sort of apply the whole sort of force of the law in being very sort of concrete about its demand. It's very kind of a withdrawn kind of way to use the law. And I would imagine this is mainly to placate the demands of the emerging nations and not, I would say, forceful enough. So nevertheless, I think the new instrument is a fascinating innovation and definitely deserves a thorough discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philipp. So I will continue with my brutally succinct approach to introductions with Laurence Boisson de Chazournes. But I should say that the panelists here are three of the most distinguished commentators we could have on the governance of the World Bank, between Devesh's work on the history of the bank, Philipp's forthcoming book on the law of development cooperation, which encompasses the bank, and Laurence's ongoing work on commenting on various aspects of the bank and its relationship to other organizations. It's really quite a privilege to be here with this group. So, to you, Laurence.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I enjoyed reading the two papers and I enjoyed listening to the presentation. As you've noticed, they're coming from different backgrounds and different angles. So the comments are going to be for each of them, and then I'm trying to spell out a few comments which might be common to both of the presenters. The first one is that Devesh Kapur is coming from an historical background, and he, in fact, I think, likes the bank, and he wants it to become a much more relevant institution. And the question that we can have is that, is the relevance tied to the level of financing, or is it tied to the knowledge of the institution? And that we can come back to. But that brings me to my first comment, is the fact that the lending also should be looked at from the angle of co-financing. And this has not really been spelled out by Devesh, but having worked with the World Bank and having seen the transformation of the organization in the 90s and the 2000s, I think what is interesting is that there is a new role for the World Bank as sort of a broker, an institutional broker in big projects, development projects. And you can think of the Nam-Tum project, you can think also of the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, where the bank, in fact, the lending of the bank was minimal. But it was an institutional lending, which in fact was a pathway for promoting the respect for certain safeguards and also for the creation, the establishment of institutions. So I feel that with the co-financing instrument, there is something to be looked at for stressing a new role for the World Bank. Now, the notion of international public good, this is something which is interesting for me, that this morning we heard that climate change was a public good, but I would say that, in fact, development is a public good, an international public good. At least the development as promoted by multilateral institutions. And in this context, development being an international public good, that means that, and that brings me to another point that Devesh made. He said, but what about these net incomes of the bank, and why should we have a transfer to IDA in terms of financement of IDA? And I think that this is a responsibility of the international community. We should be, of course, looking at the middle-sized income countries, but we also have to think about the least developed countries in the world, and there we have a collective responsibility. Third point, and I think that's something that Devesh has stressed in his paper, he wants to reduce the so-called administrative costs of the World Bank. But this, I think we also have to question this thing. There surely is room for reduction of spending and reduction of administrative costs, but the bank is also a knowledge institution, not the only one, but it's one of the knowledge institution in the field of development. It also has procedures, safeguard procedures, checks and balance mechanisms, the inspection panel being one of them. And the problem is that reducing the administrative cost is going to lead to reducing the importance of all these checks and balances, procedures and mechanisms. So it's a choice, and this is where I think that co-financing is a way to be thought about, because with co-financing, you can keep these checks and balances while having money coming from other sources, and mostly from the private sector. And I do feel that the private sector should assume its role in terms of financing of development. Now, going to Philipp's paper on the program for results financing, he is quite admirative of this new policy tool. We don't have yet an assessment of its effectiveness, but I think that there are a lot of prospects. But I think that we should be aware that it goes in line with the new spirit in terms of development, meaning I would call it the BRICS spirit, non-interference, okay? You rely on the system of states, and then you do business with the states, and you don't really question the modalities of political development within the country. And as Philipp has said, that with this new tool, there is a switch, and I think it's a fundamental switch, that now the bank is no more going to be coming from an external product, which is constituted by the safeguard procedures, but the bank is going to be working on the basis, on the assumption that the system, the country system, is adequate for implementing the development projects at stake. I would say that I don't question the interest of this approach. I always felt that the safeguard approach of the bank is a patchwork approach, which is not really relevant in terms of the complexity of development. So I would much prefer that the bank engage with countries on their own systems, and that, in fact, the bank has a meaningful dialogue about the comprehensiveness of the domestic system. So the switch, I think, is going also to have effects in other relationships that the bank is going to have with other countries. For the bank, too, I think it's going to be a way of reducing the administrative costs, because it's going to be less of a burden for the bank to be looking at its own instruments, to be adapting its own instruments, and to be putting in place its own institutions for ensuring that these instruments, the bank instruments, are respected. But there is an issue of accountability, and I think that that's where the crucial point is that the bank had put in place its own systems of accountability because it was asked by the external world to do so. But now that we're going to be relying with the international community on the national systems, how are the national systems going to be accountable to the international community? And yes, the inspection panel might play a role, and it's interesting to go on the website of the inspection panel because there is a statement of the inspection panel on the possibility for the inspection panel to exercise its role, but the panel is saying what are the criteria of acceptability of the national systems, and which should be the criteria of eligibility. Okay, so those raises questions. Now, last point, and then we will have a discussion. It's interesting that Devesh is, I think, highlighting something, that there have been some institutional reforms, but not many, in fact. And that I agree with him that I think that the bank now is at a turning point and the bank should reform itself. But what is also interesting is that Philipp is saying that the bank has, in fact, conducted a lot of reforms, and you're quite laudative because you're comparing the World Bank with other institutions such as the United Nations or UNESCO or others. And I agree with both of you. Now, the question is that, is there interconnectedness between institutional reform and policy reforms? And this is something that I think we should question. If we want to go further ahead, I think that we will have to change the identity of the institution, that we would have to change the structure of the institution. And this is something that we discussed, the three of us, before starting this session, that Devesh presented the bank composed of 4 institutions. But shouldn't we now think of rationalizing the institutional setting of the World Bank Group as such? And maybe that would give the international community more capacities for being an agent of change in the field of development. And last point, and that's, I think, a cautious note to Philipp, I'm very afraid of the rhetorical value of principles. We can have as many principles as we want. This is not a problem, and we all come with our different principles. This morning we heard about the principles of the BRICS and so on. They are not the same than the ones that Philipp wants to promote. Remember that in the 1970s, we had a principle which was the principle of duality of norms, which was very much... and this is one of the major questions, and it's also brought from my experience with the World Bank. I'm not so sure that there is yet a principled approach in the field of development assistance. With that, I will conclude my comments.
Thank you very much, Laurence. So now we have a few minutes for questions. And I have to say, Devesh, you cannot have been surprised that the lawyers would resist cutting the administrative costs, because we are administrative costs. Floor is open, David.
So I'll just, as a lawyer, I support you to. Oh, sorry, David Gartner from Arizona State University. So I want to ask a question of each. Devesh, I think your proposal is really interesting, and it goes to this sort of challenge which is central to the bank. How does it find its new place in this environment that's on the one hand much more competitive, but then as you highlighted at the beginning, it's also changing in really important ways when poverty is located in middle income countries more than, at least in total terms. But I want to just ask you about whether the premise of your solution fits with the data we have to date. In other words, the idea that we would auction fits with the history of the bank, but I'm not sure it fits with what the BRICS instincts are, and the move toward a BRICS Bank and the interest in bilateral financing over multilateral financing by China in particular. And I'm really curious if you see recent experiences as lining up with the proposal that you offer. And Philipp, I wanted to ask you about your explanation, because my sense, knowing less about this than you do, but knowing other sectors where performance-based financing was innovated, right? I mean, in many ways, I think the bank is adopting a practice that is already built up in sectors like global health and elsewhere. I wonder whether this is much more a supply-driven story of donors rather than the demand-driven story you're highlighting. So donors much more interested, as you point out, in the sort of concrete results and linking their continued financing. And I've looked a little bit in one of the other areas of innovation of the bank, which is transparency. And it's, as I looked deeper, what on its face looked like a story of leadership really taking on an issue turns out underneath to have lots of donor conditions linked to financing, particularly financing of IDA, that played a really important catalytic role there. And I'm wondering whether a similar story might account more for what you're finding there.
So one way to think of, the BRICS Bank is a response precisely to the frustration of emerging powers that these institutions will not change. So it's a response to the lack of change. I actually don't see a BRICS Bank going anywhere because there's a fundamental structural tension. A BRICS Bank is worthwhile only if it is large. It can only be large if the Chinese put in most of the money because the others don't have the money. And the others will not want a bank controlled by China, period. And so that's why this is not going to go. There's a lot of... But at the same time, I think what you are going to see is that much more, bilateral, especially from China and to some extent like from India and from like Brazil, the multilateral institutions which were a creation of the West after World War II, if they do not adapt and increase the involvement of emerging powers, it's a classic case of exit and voice. If you don't have voice, you'll exit. And in a sense, that's the step where we are. So the idea that I have is that the West is faced that either they will keep control of institutions that will become irrelevant, or you want to lose a bit of control but keep the relevance. And that's the choice that they have.
Thank you very much. I mean, is it a supply side driven change or a demand side driven? I think that it's both. And both the 2 points which I raised go in each direction. I think the donors demanded the results and effectiveness part, so the results, the disbursement linked to indicators. That certainly comes from the donor agenda. But the use of country systems and the scrapping, basically, of safeguard standards, this certainly came from the other side. So I think the instrument sort of reacts to these two pressures which the bank is facing. Now, I would like to respond also to Laurence. Is that okay? Yeah. Because it's, I mean, thank you very much for these comments. I thought they were very good. I mean, it's funny that you started with the observation that my paper and presentation sounded too full of admiration for the bank and the instrument, because the process of doing this paper was the other way around. I wrote it and I thought it was too critical, and then I tried to sort of row back a little bit, so I guess I wrote too much. Now, I totally agree with you that the instrument is certainly a fundamental switch in the way the bank operates. And I think your description that it's not anymore an external actor, but tries to be sort of an internal actor, and I think is very accurate and a very good description. And I'm very skeptical about this switch, and I draw my skepticism actually from the experiences of the bank and from the experience of the bank with its own rules. That's the interesting part, because the bank in 2005 already introduced the use of country systems in safeguarding its standards. And the experiences with that policy are pretty bad. And so it's really curious how in this new instrument, the World Bank would again use that approach and try again to sort of use the country systems for this for safeguarding substantive standards. So I'm with you that it is a switch, a fundamental switch, and I'm also with you that it contains a big problem. And I would probably say that the new instrument indicates that the bank is about to diversify its instruments, some for the able IBRD countries and others for the not so able pushover perhaps countries of IDA. So and the bank is not doing that transparently. It's not really saying that it diversifies its things. So that's one point. And perhaps the other point I wanted to pick up is on the rhetoric of principles, because I in principle, I agree with you, and I see the danger. I see the danger of the rhetoric of principles, as these are these fluffy values which might be used to sort of push certain non-mentioned values. But I think the way I understand principles in this area would be actually more principles of the process. Of how development cooperation or the delivery of aid is to be structured. So it's, if I'm talking about a principle of a collective autonomy, I basically talk about sovereignty and I talk about ownership. So I perceive the respect for ownership as one of those principles, which is a process-based kind of principle. And if I talk about individual rights or human rights, individual autonomy, I also perceive them as procedural rights, as rights of the people who might be affected by aid projects to be participants of the process. So I don't really intend to use principles really as values, but more as principles that help us to understand the procedural forces which are involved here. So I see your caution, and I can very well understand it. I hope I go in another direction more generally. Thanks.
Thank you. So I see from the schedule that we're actually supposed to break now for 5 minutes. So I guess that's just enough time to shift around in our seats. So we can do that. I know there's at least one or two questions on the queue, but our next session is also about the World Bank. So I'm hoping that the discussion there will be able to continue on from the discussion in this one. So again, let me thank our panelists here, and then we'll take a brief break. Thanks.